Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's 12:30. As always, it takes a bit of time for our attendees to come through the door. So with your indulgence, we're just going to give them another 3 minutes. We had nearly 200 registrations for today. Obviously, a keen interest in this topic. And we do know that we normally have around 50% of that joining us. So if you can bear with us just for 3 minutes, let's just help them to get their seats in the house and we will continue. Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to start the proceedings so that, because we're obviously respectful of everybody's time and conscious of time constraints. So allow me once again on behalf of the Stellenbosch Graduate Institute and Flirt Rock Governance Group to wish you a warm welcome to today and to another one of our directors' hours. Frick Landman, that normally joins me here as part of the MCs, unfortunately had to attend an urgent meeting today and would not be able to join us, but he's left it in my hands and I'm going to do my best to run the show in his absence. A special warm welcome to what I regard as a long and good-standing friend, a long-standing and a good-standing friend of mine, Dr. Victor Prozesky. Some of you, I think quite a few of you actually may know Victor because he's been in the corporate corridors for a number of years in South Africa as well. Victor is a partner and the founder of the Board Practice, which is a company that really focuses on effectiveness in the boardroom. Victor tells me that they don't only operate in South Africa, they also have presence in some other European countries like the Netherlands and Greece and Singapore, which obviously is not a European country, but not a South African company. So their focus is also on the softer issues, which, Victor, somebody else the other day when I spoke about EQ and those things as softer issues, somebody said, no, those are the essential issues. So I think Johan can say that, your focus is on the essential issues such as leadership and culture and interaction in the boardroom. Victor actually has quite an interesting background because he started, in nuclear physics. He's got a PhD in nuclear physics. So I suppose one can say that you are a person with the ability to really, deal with very complex situations, and unravel them and get to a solution. But a number of years ago, Victor joined a London-based company called Senior Executive Learning Systems, as the Chief Operating Officer. And then in 2005, 15 years ago, Victor, you joined Heidrick Struggles, which is obviously quite well known in South Africa as well and internationally in the recruitment and related areas. And I think you were there until 2012, so really 8 years ago. Victor is really a seasoned, experienced leader and leadership advisor. And I think absolutely the right person to talk to us today on the topic of strategic CEO succession. Victor, as a bit of an intro, and maybe before I get into the intro, just from a housekeeping point of view, please remember that you're more than welcome to type your comments and questions in the chat box, in the public chat area. I will keep my eye on that as well, and where possible, will also relate your questions to Victor after he's sort of done his formal presentation to us. Victor, coming back to the topic, I was doing a full-day workshop with the board and management of one of our clients yesterday on board effectiveness. And I made the point again that, in my opinion, the putting the right CEO in place, appointing the right CEO, probably one of the most important jobs of the board. It is such a key responsibility of the board, and yet, in my experience, again, my opinion, so many boards often seem to really battle with it, be it from a timing point of view, be it from, the process, be it from actually identifying the appropriate candidate. And if you consider how enormous the costs and consequences are of getting it wrong, one would think that by now boards would have much improved, on that specific duty, but seems we're not there yet. So I'm going to hand the mic over to you. Please share with us some of your well-earned wisdom on this topic. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Anna-Marie, and thank you for the kind introduction. Two comments on your introduction is what happens in the boardroom is far more complex than anything encountered in nuclear physics. So be aware of that, and that's why it's so difficult.
I agree.
And then secondly, I think Frick's absence indicate why boards do not spend enough time on issues that are forward-looking, as they are always dealing with crises, something that urgently that comes up. So it's difficult to set aside time for those things that you consider to be far in the future. And we all know that far in the future can happen very quickly and make your future horizon very short, such as the COVID crisis that has hit us. So let me use that as a starting point. The second point is boards struggle because CEO succession is difficult. If you look at something like an audit finding, it's pretty easy to solve. You look at the finding, you develop a policy, you put in a directive in place. Those who don't follow the directive, you can hit with a stick, and voila, you've got the solution. But in CEO succession, there's no answer. There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. Every company has to find its own way of making sure it happens successfully. But there are some guidelines. So those who get it right, they follow some very strong guidelines. And what I want to share with you today is how do successful companies do it? Secondly, where do boards get it wrong? And let me just confide in you, is we do multiple of these board evaluations per year, and we've done it for 20 years. And I want to say 100%, but let's make an exception and say 99% of cases, CEO succession is an issue. Sometimes worse than in other cases, but it is virtually always an issue. So it's always difficult to address. And the why is very complex, but the main reason is that it's a tough, sensitive conversation. You're dealing with people's lives, people's fears, people's ambitions, sharing information around them, making decisions around them. And that's always tricky, and it always is difficult to get the balance right. So what I want to share with you is some of our experience, and of course, some of the best practice that in this area that we have come up with, or that we have managed to read. And to Anna-Marie's point, if you know Ram Charan is probably one of the most respected writers in the field of governance board leadership. And in one of his books, he talks about the purpose of the board, and he gives the 5 top priorities of a board, and it's in priority order. So according to him, it is the most important job of a board, is to make sure you've got the right CEO, not just now, but into the future. And only then can you look at the other things and look at the order. Is make sure you've got the right CEO. Make sure that CEO is motivated, both by challenging him or her and both by rewarding him or her. Then you have to make sure they know what to do, what's the strategy. Then they need to have the right resources in place to be able to do it. And then they can look at the rest from a board perspective. So it's not only an important job of the board, it is the most important and crucial job of the board. Now, if you consider that, and then you compare, if you are involved in a board or multiple boards, how much time do you spend on the CEO and CEO succession? And I can tell you it's minute compared to the rest. And that's where the first problem is there's not enough interaction and discussion on this. So let me take you into the world of how these things work from a practical perspective. The first thing is I want to tell you where they get it wrong, because then we can look at how to get it right. And what we find mostly is that boards don't want to have that discussion very early, because you've got a new CEO. That new CEO needs to get settled in, needs to be onboarded, needs to get on with it. And then once that CEO is successful, why bother the CEO with this quite delicate discussion? The problem is, if you start on the day of appointment, it means it's about process. So if the CEO walks into his or her office and the chairman says, welcome, let's talk about the day you're not here anymore, it's about process, not about performance or the person. Whereas if you wait a year or 3, the chairman walks into the CEO's office and says, let's talk about succession, and the CEO goes, why now? Is there a message for me? And then it becomes an us versus them kind of discussion. And that is what you want to avoid. So that's the first pointer, in what you want to see in this process. The second one is, and in virtually all the cases we get, is that the control stays with the CEO. Now you see the little, I mean, it's a little bit of a joke, but it's not just inviting the turkey to Christmas, it's asking the turkey to organize it. Because the CEO will not be there on the day where this comes to fruition. So the CEO is a crucial component and a crucial part of the discussion, the process, input, because the CEO knows exactly what the internal talent can do and cannot do. But the CEO cannot control the process. And we see very little experience, very little cases where either the nomination committee, a remuneration committee, or the board has a controlling role in this. They often ask the CEO to bring them what the CEO has got, and then they listen to it and of course guide, but the control lies with the CEO. The other thing is that boards do replacement planning. So and when you hear boards talk, they will often talk about who can replace the current CEO. If the proverbial bus event happens, who can stand in? Whereas for the long term, you can't have the next CEO be exactly like the current CEO. Things happen and things change very quickly. And COVID, again, has showed us that. So how do you think about this? You should think about this as, if our strategy is successful, what will this company look like in 5 years? What kind of a CEO needs to run that company? And that will mean that any development, any thinking you do is with respect to that, not with respect to your current CEO. And of course that changes. So as things change, you need to adapt, but at least you're aiming at something. You're not just aiming at today, you're aiming at somewhere in the future, and you adapt as you go along. So you're always at least on the way somewhere. The other thing we hear that often as a criticism when you talk about a process, is that if we identify potential successors, immediately that creates a power struggle. So you either create princes in waiting, you take away some of the power of the CEO, or you create strange behavior of those who know that they are in the running. So you always have that argument. The key thing is, don't focus on a few individuals. Focus on a whole number of them, even though you might know some of them will never make it. The only thing that you can buy, at least with that, is that once you make a decision and someone does not get the job, you can give them very good feedback on why they didn't get the job. And if you want to retain them, you can actually then retain them. Because often when someone is in the running, doesn't get the job, they will simply leave. So that gives you a little lever in managing that process as well. One of the findings from one of the McKinsey studies is that one of the biggest reasons for failure in appointing a CEO is a board not explicitly agreeing on what the critical skills would be for the next CEO. And of course that links to that point number 3 as well. Because what it says is, if you don't know what you're looking for, you're certainly going to find it. And therefore, in any process, boards need to be very careful in defining exactly what they want, why they want it, not only technical skills, not only experience, but also what are what Anna Marie called the essential softer skills, EQ, agility. And one of the things that we are picking up is one of the most successful indicators now is curiosity. So successful CEOs need to be curious. They need to want to solve problems. They need to want to look into difficult aspects. And again, often boards then look at CEO succession as the process with the CEO. But if you do not link that into the organization, then you lose the sense of the whole thing. So if you measure your executive committee and you want to find out how good they are, of course you measure them against the CEO's job. If you measure one level down, you measure them against the executive committee's level. So you tailor your key skills and competencies you require to the level, but they all must be aligned. So in essence, all high potentials, all senior executives really aim towards the CEO role in terms of their development, which means your talent management becomes focused and it becomes really much more than simply trying to have personal development and make them successful in their roles. Seventh point is external view is really important. So often boards will look externally once the trigger is pulled. So either the CEO resigns, the CEO for some reason does not appear at work one day, then they look at the external view by appointing an executive search firm normally. So in this case, you start from scratch. What we say is, as you go along, why not look outside in some form, whether it's informal or formal. We've seen very informal ways. I remember the chairman of Pick n Pay, Raymond Ackerman, used to say his best way of looking at succession was a paper in his top pocket with 5 names of people in the industry that may be interesting in terms of CEOs into the future. Every time he reads the paper, he would look and see if he sees a name and whether they are successful, how are they developing, do they plan to emigrate, all sorts of things. So you can do it informally like that, or up to a formal point where one of our clients actually contacted external people and said, we're interested in your career. There's nothing that we promise or want from you. We're just interested and we want to have a coffee every 6 months or so. So you can do it in various shapes and forms. If you then talk, I mean, those are the don'ts. If you then say, well, how does that then progress into what you should be doing, is if you look at it as a single thing, as something that happens at some point, versus if you make it a progression planning, and you see the word there, it's sort of the comparison between a photograph and a movie. And of course, a movie is much richer, it's much more difficult to produce, but it gives you so much more texture and so much more of a story. And you can see all the points that I made earlier is how that plays out into making sure that this becomes a progression and not simply a replacement or a succession event. Boards typically these days need to look at this twice a year. So you look at how are my potential candidates progressing? How are the external potential candidates faring outside in terms of what I can find out publicly? And of course, then do a recheck every now and then and do a rebalance. Some names will appear on the list, some names will drop off the list. But it's really important that the board then takes care of this as a process and not as an event. How do you do that? And of course, we've developed a model, and I'll take you a little further into the model, and those are the 5 A's. And the first one is exactly as I said earlier, is find out what you want. It's that old adage of, if you have garbage in, you'll get garbage out. If you get quality in, you can get quality out. So get that alignment on what you want and what you want that CEO to achieve into the future. Make sure you understand that, you agree on that, and that is something that is measurable as well. It doesn't help that you've got this wonderful image of the perfect CEO, because that does not exist. You need to be practical, realistic, but also make sure you've got the right scope in mind. The second one is then internally, make sure you understand what you have. If you don't understand what your current leaders are capable of, if you measure them against that alignment on what that next CEO should be able to do, then you won't know where to take them, how to develop them. And then, of course, leave enough time for you to make sure that you remain realistic. At the same time, have an external view, and I've given you some indicators of how you can do that, but make sure that you've got a number of people on the outside that you've identified and that you are tracking. Of course, if you do not want to contact them, it needs to be based on public information. And then at some point, of course, the trigger is pulled for some reason. But at that time, if your process is up to scratch, you'll be able to make a good comparison. And even if the aim of that process is to simply hand over a meaningful file to an executive search company, where they can do an executive search outside and compare that to what you have inside, then already you are some distance away from simply, when the trigger is pulled, is to say, my goodness, we've done nothing, let's get an executive search firm to help us. And then as important is to make sure a CEO is settled in, is onboarded, and make sure the CEO lands safely. Because if you appoint someone from the outside, there's a very serious chance of organ rejection from the internal organization. And there's also, if it's from the outside, there's some very good research that there's a very good chance of failure. If you look at changes in any senior executive's life, so changing from one position to the other, and becoming a CEO is normally accompanied by huge risks of rejection or failure. For instance, a guy at Harvard has done research where he says if you change 2 parameters, which means either something like a country, so a new CEO needs to change countries, new CEO needs to change industry, There are 7 considerations, but if 2 of them are changed, there's a 25% risk of failure within the first 6 months. If you change 3 of them, that failure rate goes up to 50%. So when you appoint an external person, you need to make very sure that that person lands safely, is supported, make sure there's integration that takes place, all of those things. So even after the fact, the job of CEO succession is not over yet. And of course, we've developed in our little model, you can see this is just putting it in a sort of a flow diagram. Make sure that you have a continuous loop. So do a comparative assessment. We do it every 6 months, so we recommend and we assist our clients to do it. And make sure you've got different time horizons. Who will be the stand-in candidate if there's an emergency? Who are we looking at who are nearly ready? And who are we looking at in the long term? So those are the critical important factors to take care of. And I think I've used my time. So Anna-Marie, this is why I would want to stop.
Thank you, Victor. Thanks for that. Let me get back online to also look you in the eye. And yeah, I really enjoyed this presentation and looking at the detail of it. And you know what struck me while I was listening to you? I'm wondering whether what we're really saying is that what could be of value in listening to, you know, all the challenges and all the pitfalls that went through my mind was the possibility of actually writing up, and I mean, I don't want policies and procedures and processes, but I do think that it could take and remove a lot of the anxiety, uncertainty, misunderstandings if we actually as a board have a formal policy on CEO succession. Let's formalize it, you know, let's clarify my favorite saying, let's clarify the rules of engagement up front. You know, I think that does, you know, help to take some of the uncertainty and fear out of the process. What's your view on something like that?
Oh, absolutely. We often develop that, and we don't call it a policy, we call it a CEO succession process, because the word policy immediately puts some compliance aspect to it. Which, and it also sort of puts it into a more rigid framework. So if you call it just a process, then you can describe it, but you can also keep on adapting it without sort of going through quite a formal process. But that's quite important, and it needs to identify the role players as well on the board. Because one of the main complaints we get is that those directors who are not members of either the Remuneration or the Nomination Committee, whoever takes care of this, will always say either it's not discussed at all at the board because simply we find it too sensitive, or when it's discussed, it's on a very high level. So we cannot make up our minds whether the process is good enough, whether there are areas where we can contribute. So defining the role players, defining the process, making sure what the involvement of the CEO is. We see more and more, even where directors, so non-executive directors, are putting into mentoring positions for senior executives below the executive committee. And of course, this has got a twofold sort of rationale behind it. The first one is find out how good people really are, because if you deal with them in a mentorship role, you can sort of find out how good their leadership skills are, how they are developing into the future, etc. The second thing is it gives the board another point of access to the organization. So it gives them access to the culture, to what makes the company tick. If there are some red flags coming up in any company, they might detect it by having that access. Of course, that's quite tricky. So you have to have a very firm description of what that mentoring role is. It has to be through the okay with the CEO, etc. But making sure you understand what you want to achieve, how you achieve it, who's involved doing what, critically important.
Thanks. And you actually touched on something that I wanted to then ask you, and that is the ownership of this whole process. As you say, it's like a hot potato, you know, don't know who has to handle it, and you know, duck and dive and pass the buck and all those sorts of sayings come to mind. How do you, you know, what do you think is the ideal accountability ownership? How should it practically actually be driven by whom, and who should take the lead?
Yeah, of course, the final accountability lies with the whole board. So So ultimately, the whole board needs to take the accountability for the whole process. So if you start from that, all of them need to be informed, all of them need to have some way of participation. So to some extent, you need to have these discussions at board level. So you can determine at what level and to what level of detail, but you have to have that discussion there. In our mind, what happens too often is that the chairman and the CEO are the two having this conversation, and they have a sort of a point of view, and they might or might not share that with the board, but that the succession process lies in the head of the CEO and the chairman. That simply cannot be right, because both of them can disappear on some day and you lose that thinking. So that's the most basic reason for that. So you have to have it in committee format so that there's minutes of that, firstly, or some kind of a record. And secondly, it gives a committee the responsibility to make sure that it does happen. And normally this happens at either the remuneration, or these days we see a lot of combination of nomination and remuneration committees. But it needs to be at the committee level. We normally prefer the nomination committee to do that, because normally your chairman of the board is also chairman of that committee, which creates directly the link as well. Because the chairman is a key player in this, because the chairman, in our view, is in the end the one who really has to be the responsible person if you want to appoint a responsible person. And if that is as chair of the committee, then of course it makes so much more sense.
Yeah, I do think the important point that you raise here is the issue around communication, that it's not just a close to the chest internal, process that, everybody, nobody wants to really raise or ask the question, that it's really, it's something that, it's in the open, that's discussed openly. And coming back to our formalized process, even new CEO and I'm involved in a company where we will shortly be introducing a new CEO. And I think if we, from day one, he realizes that, from day one, we're going to talk about CEO succession, because that's our process. It's obviously far less, what's the right word? The fear and the anxiety will be far less, if it's done that way. So I think that, is important. But of course, as you've pointed out, from a time frame point of view, is the unintended consequences from starting what perceived to be starting too soon, that you could potentially be creating expectations amongst other, staff members and executives. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, as to talk about that a little bit later on again. But how do you manage that in a way that does not cost the company in the loss of potentially good candidates that are disappointed because they do not get the position?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's one of the reasons why this is so difficult. For instance, if you start on the day of appointment, the average tenure of a CEO is now between 5 and 7 years. So if you appoint someone and you start the process immediately, that means that you are going to start to identify, develop, talk about, it'll be somewhere on the surface about a process that will last long. And any person identified in that process will say, so for the next 5, 7 years, I'm going to sit around developing myself without a chance of getting the role unless there's the proverbial bus. So you need to manage that firstly. Secondly, as I already mentioned, make it a large group of people. So even if in the mind of the committee there are only 2 or 3 potential candidates, make it at least 10 people, so that you've got executive committee members, you've got maybe one level below that. Because if you understand that, you can also then start to say, when do we recruit someone who could potentially grow into the next CEO role, and at what level, and for what reason, in what role? So all of those things play a role. If you make it large enough, everyone knows that this is a process. I am also looked at, but there's no indication that I might be the preferred candidate, or one of 2 maybe. So that's the best way of doing it. On the way, you will certainly have lots of frustrations. So we have good cases in South Africa where deputy CEOs, for instance, have been in place for 5, 6, 7 years with the intent of putting them in a CEO role. And the chance of losing them after a few years is just massive. So you need to always manage that, always manage the process. And the most important part is to manage that after the appointment of your preferred candidate. So once you have a new CEO, manage that process. If you want to exit some of them, because a new CEO might say, you know what, I want to have a new broom that sweeps some of them out of the door, make sure that's managed carefully, but those that you want to retain, make sure you tell them why not, whether they might be in the running in the next round, or whether there's some alternative for them.
Thanks. And I think they probably let me talk, just make the point then here already, because I think it leads into, what we've just said, into that point. And this is the fact that the process doesn't stop. You've, I think, already alluded to that as well, but I want to take a little bit further, that it doesn't stop the day that the new CEO is signed on the dotted line and he walks into, the corner office and he sits down. Because the reality as well is that for his success, and on paper he could look like, the best things than sliced bread, but let's face it, at the end of the day, it is really a team effort. And so he's very dependent, in my view, and I'm just sharing my perception, and I'd like to hear from your side. He's very dependent on support from the executives. And so if there's not a proper understanding of the people, emotional human side of all of this, and it's not properly managed, you could actually set this person up for failure, because he gets sabotaged, could potentially get sabotaged by one or more of his team who does not want him to succeed.
Absolutely. And what you say is especially important if there is an external appointment. There's some very good research that shows that the best time to appoint an external person is if you need drastic change. So if for some reason business as usual is not good enough, it's virtually always better to appoint someone from the outside, simply because they bring in fresh ideas, some perspectives that they've learned somewhere else. So that's the first thing. The moment you want drastic change, a new CEO is going to walk in the door and make those changes. And no one of us likes change, which means the chances of a new CEO wanting to make change being accepted by the top team is a lot less than an internally promoted CEO who probably will go on tweaking business as usual rather than making drastic change. So the human element of this is critically important, and that is why boards need to make very sure that when they go through the process, do some scenario planning on what you think may happen when the CEO lands. Any good CEO interview process goes along with what would your strategy be, what changes would you bring, so that the board knows what the next CEO is intending to achieve, and see potential pitfalls in that, see potential character clashes, see potential personality clashes, and try and manage that, or proactively plan to manage that. But that's why this is so difficult. It's because it's about people. And when you talk about people, I have a friend who always says, I love all this stuff about leadership. It's just a pity about the people. It's because it's difficult. You deal with people.
Yeah, that human element, it is not an easy part of the business to run. I sometimes, it's to the point, you and me in the same corner, because I make the point when we talk about companies being, separate legal entities and legal persons, like a human person, but it needs, somebody or something to give it a soul and ears and eyes, and a mind. I do sort of make tongue-in-cheek the point that it's unfortunately, the company is dependent on human beings to give it a soul. So, yeah, just the cynical me after 30 years in this industry. But just on the point on external versus internal, I saw in doing a bit of research as well, and you have alluded to that as well. The one thing that was interesting for me that I've never picked up is on research that they say that the annual compensation of an external appointed CEO could be as much as 75 to 100% higher than the annual compensation of an internal candidate. That has never struck me. Is that your view? Do you share that opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's some good research, and we've actually seen that as well. Because an external candidate comes, of course, with a zero baseline. And that zero baseline just means that it's not the baseline of the organization that they are entering into. And they've got far more negotiation space than someone who sits in the organization at a particular level and a particular structure of compensation, which means they can only negotiate and tweak it from there, whereas the incoming CEO from outside actually has much more room to maneuver. So no, that's a very clear indication of that. The one thing that does happen is not only does an external CEO gets more on the average, but it also takes much longer to appoint an external CEO. So if you have an internal process, or your internal process leads to someone where the CEO says, you know what, I'm out of here in 3 months, the board prepares and after 3 months announces the successor. Whereas if that happens, a search process starts, and I know the search consultants would always promise you it'll happen in 3 months. The average is probably more than 6 months. And it's not only the direct costs of the search and the not having a CEO, but it's on the organization as a whole, because to an extent it becomes leaderless. If it's not, you have a stand-in CEO in whom you might create expectations. So there are all sorts of fallouts apart from just paying the higher salary.
So I want to come back to the point that you've just raised also on the, the emergency interim position. But I want to just quickly go to our question side, because Janice asked us, she said, please, can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by embedding the role as for a newly appointed CEO? Just to give Janice a bit of guidance on what that would entail. Thanks, Victor.
Yeah, thanks, Janice. Embedding or onboarding is something where 20 years ago, if a CEO arrived, basically the onboarding that he or she would get is a good handshake by the chairman and where the corner office is. And then he or she was on their own. But these days, there's a very structured process of making sure that even prior to taking the position, so having signed the contract, prior to going into the office, is to start informally meeting with some of the executive committee members, maybe traveling to one of the sites or an operation, but slowly being introduced as that people can know what's coming, people understand the person. So it's not just on one day. You all know the American way of doing it, where the CEO stands on the stage, or the chairman, and then announces the new CEO, and the new CEO comes dancing in, and that's sort of the introduction. It's much more nuanced these days. So it's much more smoother, longer term. Make sure that the CEO has and some people hate this, but a 100-day plan, which can either be informal or formal as you like. And that plan should include how to integrate, not only what are you going to do to take this company forward, but how do you plan to integrate with the assistance of either the chair or the committee. And it's quite a structured process. So you can have how they meet people, when they meet people, how they introduce certain aspects of, let's say, new strategy or new thinking to the organization, how the communication with shareholders will take place, when the first meetings will take place. So all of those are choreographed quite strongly, and it makes the entrance a lot easier than simply for a CEO to find his or her way around.
I think, thanks, Victor, for that. I think also an element of that, ideally, if we get it right, ideally, one item on that process action list is time spent with the outgoing CEO. But if we don't get it right, then we lose often that benefit, but that is critical as well. And to your point on the 100 days, I saw somewhere also talking about the 100 days, but again saying, research is saying, it's actually 12 to 18 months that you really need to give your new CEO, which is obviously also often difficult because your CEO they're normally there because they're driven, they're achievers and they want to just get running. And to some extent, you've got to hold the horse back and say, Hambagashli, take it slowly, get into the rhythm of things. We don't expect you to start shooting out the lights tomorrow. Just find your way around everything first.
Yeah, fully agree. And the first things that a new CEO needs to do is to make sure he or she understands the personalities facing. So the first line of the executive committee, the board itself, and understand where the issues may arise. So it's all about people at the beginning. And if you look at it that way, then it looks like things are going slowly. But building relationships, making sure communications channels are right, making sure what kind of authority you do use. Is it a visionary authority? Is it sort of a dictatorial authority, if your surname is Trump, what kind of a way of the organizational culture that you want to establish. So those things look pretty slow if you look at the company and its strategy and its products and everything around that. But those are the important aspects to get right before you're able to then, of course, go into doing all the technical stuff.
And maybe before I get to Kantha's question, Victor, it's in my own mind also asking myself, how does the board then, through that, give the CEO the room, to do that, but at the same time, again, keeping the communication channels open so that the board, to some extent, in the background, takes this journey with the CEO. Understanding what is he spending his time on, how is this progressing? What was some of the stuff that he, I was just thinking in my back of my mind, part of how we formalize this process, to establish some kind of, again, a formal kind of communication line between the CEO and the board outside of meetings, where he just, from the desk of the new CEO, I've seen this, I've done that. These are some of my takeaways. Just, that kind of maybe at first ongoing to also establish the relationship with the board.
Yeah, I think that's part of the critically important sort of process of onboarding as well. And what we normally recommend is, for instance, the CEO, new CEO and chairman to at least once a week connect in the first 100 days. So that also that both of them can sort of sound each other out on where things are going. Are we on track? Do we send out the right signals? What we see more often than that even is that you hopefully have some in industry or similar company experts on the board, is that there are also interactions with those and they give their input, sound out. So lots of interaction at informal levels in both directions. And then, of course, a CEO that at the beginning, probably every 2 weeks, saying this is what surprised me, this is what I found, this is where we're going, here's some of my thinking. That allows the board then also to buy into where the new CEO is slowly taking things, because it does happen slowly. It can't happen all in one day. So building those relationships, establishing those channels, is not only important for onboarding, but for afterwards as well, so that you've got an established way of working. I remember in Jim Collins's book, Good to Great, and I probably don't need to explain what the background of that was, but one of the great CEOs said, during this period of greatness, I asked more questions from the board than the board asked me. Wow. Now that's profound. Yeah. Because any good CEO will tell you, if I start to ask too many questions, they will ask, well, do we have the right CEO, if he or she does not know that? So there's a dangerous territory. But if a CEO and the board is mature enough that the CEO can stand in front of them and say, I need some guidance on this, it can create an extremely beneficial atmosphere and productive atmosphere, because both sides can learn from that. But it's fraught with danger as well.
No, absolutely. I'm going to, thanks, Victor, going to Kantha's question. She says, would you recommend that a CEO designate position is created for the identified CE to spend time with the outgoing CE?
Normally that's not done, because normally what you want to do is you want to keep the current CEO's power intact for as long as possible, because the moment you make the announcement, you've got a new CEO. And then you may have a CEO that's not allowed to execute because the CEO designate still sits somewhere in an exco position or still has a function to run rather than taking over the organization. So leave it for as long as possible, because then the CEO can keep power. But once you've made the announcement, what many boards do and what many companies do is to announce, let's say that in 3 months' time, 2 months' time, here's the new CEO. And by the way, our existing CEO will stay on for another 6 months as a period of handing over, which means the new CEO takes over, can execute, and can put the stamp on whatever needs to be done, but has access to the old ways and the old thinking through the existing CEO.
No, and I think that also sort of takes me a little bit to the point around an interim CEO. Just talk to me a little bit about your experience on the pitfalls of having this interim person in that position as CEO. In my mind, not ideal. and a number of reasons, but I'd love to hear, your views on again, how does the board then identify the risks and manage the risks of that interim position?
Yeah, that's under normal circumstances not a good thing. So what we have seen is that when boards suddenly want to have a shake-up of the organization, they'll put an interim CEO in who's got some massive mandate for change, which means you can actually shake up the organization and then after that put in a permanent CEO who can then stabilize things, but you've achieved the change you want. So unless you want that kind of scenario, it's by far more preferable to have a candidate that can take over on a permanent basis. The problem with an interim CEO is not fully doesn't have the full authority. So firstly, for them to execute is quite difficult. And secondly, they are either preparing themselves to step into the role of a permanent CEO or brushing up their CV, because if they don't get the job, they're probably out of there.
Absolutely.
So they don't spend their full attention on saying, you know what, this is a new role, I'm going to take it and I'm going to be a success in it, because they know it's a limited time frame.
Thanks, Victor. I'm going to quickly go back to Janice. I'll get to your question around remuneration, but I'm quickly going to go to Red's question. Red said she liked the comment that you made about maturity. I think it talks to one of our earlier director hours topics of EQ, and a healthy ego. She's asking, do you know of any kind of tool assessment where one can, if your board is willing to do that, to subjective stuff, I'm not so convinced about that, but to test the level of maturity of a board.
There are many such instruments that can test maturity. It's fraught with danger at board level, because the real dilemma with boards, and I often get asked from a board, are we a high performing team? And we always say, you are not even a team. Forget about high performing, and you should not be a team. You're not going to walk on coals or climb mountains together. You need to sit down every quarter, or maybe a little more frequently, look each other in the eye, or look each other on the screen even these days, and make sure that you understand, can you trust? Because a lot of this is simply based on trust. What I see in front of me, I can trust, and I have to make it a gut response, have a gut response to it. So it can't be done in a team kind of setup, but there are tools that you can use. I can tell you, in my whole experience, we've had 2 boards that allowed us to do that kind of instrument on them. And simply because, and in my view, it's probably because the most non-executive directors on the ego scale level is somewhere at the top. And therefore, it becomes very difficult. How do you tell a director, unless you do a very well-balanced peer review, that they don't have the right EQ for this kind of job or maturity? It's very
I think as well, there's a huge level of a lack of self-confidence and in those sorts of, and not wanting to be seen to fall, short of expectations. There's been 1 or 2 questions around remuneration, and Janice touched on, sounding your remuneration sounding in foreign currency. Personally, I must tell you, the whole issue around executive remuneration and the divide between highest and lowest paid in organizations is a very sensitive and topic for me, and one that I get quite emotional around. But and I just think it's going even more crazy. But what's your views on CEO succession and particularly, the foreign currency kind of potential element to that?
Yeah, I think, it's a complex thing. So what I say is my opinion, and probably a naive one at that, is the 2 drivers for me of why remuneration, especially remuneration at the top, is so high, is that executive search fees are based as a percentage on the salary, or let's call it the guaranteed income of the first year. So the higher they can negotiate on behalf of the incoming CEO, the more fees they get. No, they declare that up front, and everyone knows that, so it's taken care of. But of course, that is what's happening. They drive it up. The second one that drives it up, and it's not the CEO. The CEO is somewhere in the middle, and of course will negotiate as much as he or she can. But it's the organizational policy, because we see most organizations say we want to pay our people in the 75th percentile. Now think about that statement. If everyone pays in the 75th percentile, Next year, pay goes up by 25% because you're 25% above the average. Next year, we want to pay again. So you drive up your own remuneration because you want to be seen to be a well-paying organization. And therefore, organizations should say, we pay on the 50th percentile, but our performers, we pay a lot more than that. And those who don't perform, we pay a lot less than that. So remuneration is an art. I have not found a remuneration committee that says we have found the secret recipe, because there is none. It depends on industry, it depends on the level of performance within the organization, depends on the flexibility. If you look at most companies today, long-term incentives are underwater because of COVID. What do you do? In commodity terms, if you're in a commodity business, these are the days when your executives and the CEO work hardest. They'll spend a lot of time to get them out of trouble. They're not going to get bonuses for it. In times when the commodity cycle turns, they can do nothing and they'll print money and they'll get huge bonuses. How do boards deal with that? It's not a simple question. So you can easily say they get paid too much, and you can easily put the blame game in there, but it's very tough to get right. And it's very tough to set up a system in bad times and then good times come and it seems like you were excessively paying your executives because it's not easy to achieve. So you can't get it right. You can try the best you can.
No, it's absolutely. I think, Victor, I jokingly always say that I do not have enough degrees to understand remuneration. It's just becoming so complex, and in the interest of transparency and accountability, that's not helping either. I think we're also shooting ourselves in the foot as far as that is concerned, because it's so complex that it's like financial reporting standards. Nobody can understand financial statements anymore because it's become so complex, and I think remuneration is going the same route. Richard did make a comment in our chat box, although it's not directly linked to our topic, but also talking about remuneration, but more also you've linked, doing transformation and rebranding, and which is going to be quite necessary for a number of organizations, as we follow out of and come out of, hopefully come out of the current, pandemic and everything that it's going to leave in its wake.
Yeah, I'm no expert in staff remuneration, so looking at remuneration below the CEO and an executive committee band. But the best way of looking at this is know what is happening in your industry or happening at comparative levels of remuneration, because then you can manage it. What you don't measure, you can't manage. So understand as much as you can and then make up your mind on what you want to do about it. And that's about as much as I want to say, because I think remuneration at the lower levels are in any case something which is done mostly with benchmarking, mostly through getting outside consultants to assist you with. There are all these tools at Hay and etc. to be able to allow you to benchmark, and I think make use of those. But make up your own mind on what you want to do with it.
No, and remain accountable. I think transparency and accountability also, if those are the two values that underlies your remuneration structures, it also makes you think a little bit, carefully before you come with all sorts of interesting, schemes, etc. Ariette made this, I want to just highlight that because I hear from her comment, I can see where she's coming from. We were talking about sort of, the EQ and the maturity of individuals, but she's also saying, how do you test the maturity of the board as a whole, and whether there's any tools or anything around that. So that is a little bit of a different slants on it, angle than what we were talking about.
Yeah.
But Victor, you want to say something on that?
No, I just wanted to say informal tools are much better than formal tools, because what we have found is if you do a peer review process when you do the board effectiveness process, that can guide the chairman a long way in saying, well, what is the EQ of each of my board members? Because to some extent you get that information, of course, as part of that. But of course, use that very carefully, because you don't want to start to sound like you're doing performance management on your board members, because you did not select them because of their balanced view. You might have selected them because they are very strong industry knowledge. They might not be someone who can give you a very broad perspective on things. So it depends on why you choose them. What does maturity mean? Does it mean you can have sort of balanced debates, or does it mean that you are a maverick and you come up with every now and then with a very left-wing suggestion? which can be disruptive, but can change the discussion to positive as well. So you have to be careful what you define as mature.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. Red is also commenting on the divide in remuneration and whether we believe, and it's a question that I've asked myself as well, do we think we will ever see a closing of the gap in between executive, highest and lowest remunerated in organizations? Have you seen any trends showing that globally?
No. And it's not going to happen very soon. The only way we can see that happen is a big discontinuity. Now, we thought COVID might bring that. So, COVID is still with us, so we haven't seen the full reaction and the full result. But we need something like a discontinuity because there's no incentive to drive it down outside of pressure. And the pressure comes from media and the public and maybe the authorities and the regulators. But how do they put that in place? In the UK, after the financial crisis, they put a cap on bonuses, so you can actually regulate that in terms of bonuses. But on the average, it's extremely difficult. And you always have this argument: we need to attract the best there is, and then I compare that with the outside world, and I pay them a little more, and there I go again. So I've pushed it up once again. So it's a complete mindset that needs to change.
Victor, I wish we had more time because I would have loved to also touch and chat to you a little bit about, I think, also CEO succession in the public sector, because I think that and maybe one day we can actually do that and I don't know how many people, public sector on our call or registered for this webinar, but they have a particular challenge because often their shareholder responsible minister is the one that ultimately make that appointment. And, I think we can really help there as well. So maybe I must, invite you back for a session. And I also wanted to chat to you a little bit about female CEOs, but time is, is not on our side. So I think if I can wrap up, what we've been talking about, I think the bottom line really is that what we're saying is it's not easy, it's complex. I don't think there's a fail-proof recipe that will work for every organization. I think the costs of not getting CEO succession right are enormous, and they're also, they're obvious and subtle, and but also immediate and long-lasting. So the expertise in the governance process, in your organizational behavior, and if you apply that with rigor and real independence, I think it reduces the risk, and increase the opportunity of you getting it right. But I think bottom line is we really can't afford to get it wrong. So thank you for your insights. Very, very valuable. I think we could really have continued for another hour or so. So thank you. Thanks to all of you that have again joined us today. For our organizer behind the scene, Wayne, as always, you're a star. Those of you in the room today, I do trust, like myself, you've gained something interesting from today and some valuable to go and think about. Victor, thank you once again on behalf of SGI and Flirt Rock. We really appreciate it. Go well and have a good afternoon and a good rest of this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Victor.